and welcome to Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make the Elm City tick. It's Mayor Monday, just like last Monday, just like the Monday before. Mayor Toni Harp is back here in the WNHH studios, ready to talk about what's new in New Haven. Tom, you had another question? Thank you for holding on the line.
Oh, yes, certainly. My other question is actually related to an article I read in The Independent last week about how Yale is currently opening for discussion whether or not to change the name of one of their residential colleges, which is currently named Calhoun College, after a South Carolina senator from the mid-19th century who kind of embodied the ideology of slavery. And I think there's some debate, especially now with all the very high-profile incidents in the past year and more of African-American civilians being abused in a very public way by people often white in power, that maybe this is not an appropriate name for that school. Has this item come across your radar, and do you feel strongly about whether or not New Haven should have such a prominently placed institution named after someone who represents slavery?
Thank you, by the way. Thank you very much for those really spot-on questions. I guess so. The call is asking about John C. Calhoun College, which is one of the 12, soon to be 14, residential colleges at Yale, named after a U.S. senator from the early, I believe, 1800s, who was a prominent national senator and one of the foremost defenders of slavery as being good for both white people and African slaves. So now Yale, the president of Yale this weekend sent out a committee letter along with the dean saying, let's talk about this. South Carolina took down the flag. Should we change this title?
Well, I think that one of the things that I can say as a descendant of slaves, that it's something that continues to scar this country and to scar people of African descent. And in many respects, I certainly would love to see the name changed. They don't have a name of an abolitionist for the name of a college. So I would hope that discussion happens, that we find a way to change it.
Frederick Douglass College.
That would be something to consider.
So people, I think this has been a fascinating conversation in the country now, and a really healthy conversation, about how do we honor and how do we not, and where do you draw the line? So Calhoun has been a focus because he was such a defender of slavery, and he went to such lengths, and he had such an important position. And I don't think he gave money to Yale, if I'm mistaken. They were just looking for prominent alums to name the college after in those days. Because this was the 1930s when they named it after Calhoun. He'd been long dead. So it wasn't like nowadays when they name people stuff that way. Where do you draw the line? Like Jefferson had slaves. Thomas Jefferson, also an inspiration for people who have fought for more equality, kind of laid that groundwork. How do we draw the line on who gets stuff named after and who doesn't, you think?
Well, I think it's really tough because sometimes you name something and you find out later that they were a child molester.
They had a baseball. Well, like they had a baseball stadium. For a guy's name at Yale, and it turned out the guy committed massive securities fraud or something and went to jail, and they had to rethink that.
And so I think that we live in a time where, as you learn things and you can make more reasoned decisions, that you ought to be able to change.
And so you think Calhoun would be an example of where to change?
I believe it would be.
What do you think about Jefferson?
Jefferson had other broader views about freedom, and that at the time he probably didn't ascribe to women and Africans, but that if you do, I think the broadness of his view about humanity distinguishes him from others.